Let me begin by thanking the Center for Historical Studies for taking the initiative to organize this memorial meeting in honor of Professor Panikkar, one of the founders and stalwarts of the center. It is only fitting that we should get together here today and collectively pay our tributes to him. But you know, the days are such that one sometimes is very grateful for these small mercies. So I do wish to place on record my appreciation of the fact that we have done this. Much has been said about his academic and other achievements as a teacher, etc. So let me try and just fill in a few gaps since we are recounting his life. Maybe some things which would be of interest to all of you, but haven't so far been talked about. I want to, since I had, I'm perhaps the only person here who was taught by him in Delhi University. He was my teacher in 1970-71 in the second year of my master's program, because we used to have the specialization, that is Modern India, which I took in the second year of the MA program, and came in as a teacher from Hansraj College, but who used to come and the Delhi University had this custom, I think it still does, where teachers from colleges come and teach in the department. So he was one of those, along with Professor Bipin Chandra, who was of course there in the department, and others who I had the opportunity of studying from, and that was my first meeting with him. And I must say that he was a first-rate teacher, a very approachable person, and by the way, he did teach us political history, the book which Aditya mentioned, which is rarely talked about. And maybe I'm one of the very few people who's actually studied that book thoroughly, and I can tell you that it's a very fine piece of work. And you know, as we now often go back to things which we thought were quite outdated some time ago, I think political history is coming back in. I think we would discover it's a very careful, meticulously researched piece of work for the first part of the 19th century, what the British were doing here, and focusing on the residency, a very careful look at the records. It's a very fine piece of work of the old style history of that time. He worked under the masters. So that was one, so I just wanted to tell you. But a little bit about his early years, which he often used to talk about. He was very rooted in Kerala. I do want to talk about that. He grew up in Trichur and often talked at great length about his childhood and his youth. I don't know how many of you know that he was a very well-known student leader of the SFI in Kerala before he came to Rajasthan to do his masters. And he was a recognized and known orator in Malayalam. At that time, he was familiar with and knew on intimate terms the top leadership of the CPM, like EMS, for example, with whom he had personal. And I know that even early years when he was in JNU, when he would write something, he would often send it to EMS. And there was a continuous communication between them. So he had this whole career, which in a sense got interrupted, a kind of student political activist career, because he came away to North India. And that was largely because at the Rajasthan University, he got a fellowship. So he came here to study, and then he stayed on for a PhD, and where he met his dear wife, Usha. She was a classmate. She's from Rajasthan, and then got married, and then came to Delhi and started teaching at the Hansraj College. And then we know from Hansraj College he came to JNU. Interestingly, KN and I joined the CHS virtually at the same time. I think probably the difference might have been a day or two, because our interviews, our selections took place either again on the same day or maybe 1 or 2 days here and there. So early June of 1972 is when we both joined the Center for Historical Studies, I as a very young lecturer, and Ken, of course, as an established scholar and senior teacher. And Well, I must say that I would like to place on record that I was very fortunate in that I found in him a senior but a very good friend and mentor. Spent a lot of time with him, especially in the early days when we all had more time. And his house on the old campus, where he had moved in after joining the CHS. I don't know if you remember, there were those, in the old campus, there was those few houses. It was, no, not in the blocks, hostel blocks, but these were behind that. So there were separate flats over there, and he moved in over there, and often in the evening after classes, we would walk across, and that's how one got to know Usha and Shalini, little Shalini, and little older Ragini. I also want, before I go on to a few other things, I also want to tell you some other things about him as a person. I don't know again how many of you knew that he was a painter. And in fact, in his study in the JNU house, there was a canvas, and often he would do that for days on end. He was very fond of painting. And again, I don't know how many of you know that he was a writer in Malayalam. No? So there were many, many aspects to his personality, and because he was on the whole a quiet man, somebody who was not garrulous in the sense like many of us who talk 19 to the dozen and make sure everybody knows what we are doing, you had to spend quiet long hours in congenial circumstances, perhaps over his favorite scotch, where he would then open up and talk about his past, his childhood, his family, and things that mattered to him. And I was fortunate enough to have been in many of those conversations, and I value that relationship very much. Also wanted to, since I'm on this, that he really, another aspect was that he loved the good things of life. As I said, he loved good scotch, he loved good cheese, salamis, good fish, good mutton. And so he was somebody who, he was not an ascetic. He was a quiet person, I said, but he was not somebody who did not enjoy the good things of life. And I think that was what made him such a multi-hued, rich personality, Of course, with his students, he was a wonderful man. I know from many of his students, he helped them in all kinds of ways which one will, which don't need even a mention, not just emotionally, academically, of course, but emotionally, sometimes financially. He also supported large numbers of members from his family who used to come and be with him in Delhi. So he had very strong roots continue to have strong roots with his family. And just want to make, also, I mustn't forget this, talking about the Malayalam part. I don't know again how many of you know, because I've not seen it mentioned anywhere in the write-ups, that just a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote his autobiography in Malayalam. And in fact, when we last visited him in Trivandrum, I think it was probably 1.5 years ago, he showed us his autobiography, and I was very happy to see that there was a photograph in that in which I was there. So that he had cared enough to have a photograph in which I was there. I was rather flattered. So, all these things about him, and probably that's the last book he wrote, which is in Malayalam. And again, I also want to say that when we are talking about his academic interests, because he spent, of course, and that was one of the major contributions he made, was on bringing intellectual and cultural history into the mainstream of discussion. But his Malabar book gets left out, except it's mentioned, but the significance of that. And since I was working on peasant struggles and agrarian structure and all that, this was a common area that we shared, and we would often talk about. That is the time that he was writing this book. So his perception, his understanding I mean, I'm not going to go into a analysis of what is there in the book, but actually, and today when actually the politically speaking, the Mapla rebels have been thrown out of the annals of the freedom fighters, I think his book is very important politically as well. I mean, you know that this has happened. So I think, there are a lot of very interesting aspects to his work. I said the early work, the peasant movement, agrarian structure work, and also, otherwise also, there are, which he edited, but he was very strongly rooted in studies on Kerala history. So there's a regional history, strong dimension of focusing on regional history, and he had the great advantage of knowing the language well. So once he went back to Kerala in 2000, and as you know, he was first vice-chancellor, founding vice-chancellor of the Sanskrit University, and though by name it is Sanskrit, but it's actually a broad-based university and set up as a very fine university, just a little bit away from Cochin. And then, as Aditya mentioned, he was founder chairman of the KCHR, the Kerala Council for Historical Research. Then the Higher Education Council again, he headed for many years. So he played a very important role in promoting studies, scientific, sophisticated studies into Kerala history. So his contribution to the regional history of Kerala is also something that we need to remember. I'm not going to repeat anything about his work in the field of intellectual and cultural history. Aditya stole all my stories about the only TV and the only car, so I won't repeat them. Except to add that he forgot that the Sunday movies were also something that his house was invaded for, apart from the Chitrahar. So there were 2 evenings a week when Professor Panikkar's house was invaded to watch good old days of Doordarshan. Okay. The one thing that I want to put on the table is many contributions, but I recall vividly, again, it's academic stroke political, when the Babri Masjid incident, etc., was all, that whole phase. And when the center got together to bring out that pamphlet on the whole issue, Panikkar played a leading role in that. I think it was also that he happened to be the chairperson at that time, if I'm not mistaken. We all were signatories, but he played a leading role in putting all that together, and which stated, in a sense, the position. I think there was only one person who didn't sign, so we didn't put it out as a center's statement. So it was a signed statement by everybody in the center minus 1 or 2, whatever. And that was, I think, a very, very important academic stroke political intervention, because clearly the whole Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi issue, the demolition, everything has been a major, major turning point in Indian history. And that the Center for Historical Studies played some role, and that Panikkar was in the middle of it and leading it, I think is something we need to put down. Out of that then came the book, the larger book of, which was the Anatomy of a Confrontation, which was edited by S. Gopal, in which the first piece is this. So I just thought I'll fill in some of the gaps and not repeat what everybody has said. I would like to use this opportunity, since Shalini and Ragini are both here, to express on all our behalf our condolences, as well as say that, they can be proud that their father was such a wonderful man, such a wonderful teacher, such a fine scholar, and somebody who's remembered with such affection and warmth by so many people, as was their mother. Thank you.